Our guest is Jeffrey Sachs. Sachs is widely considered to be the leading international economic advisor of his generation. For more than 20 years, he has studied the challenges of economic development and has been a pioneer in the fight against poverty. As the editor of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, he leads large-scale efforts to mitigate human-induced climate change. Sachs works with governments all over the world and serves as a special advisor to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He is the author of hundreds of scholarly articles, and his best-selling books include Commonwealth and The End of Poverty. In his most recent book, The Price of Civilization, Sachs argues that American-style capitalism has not been adequate in facing modern challenges. On October 11, 2011, Jeffrey Sachs visited the Herbst Theater in San Francisco to be interviewed on stage by Roy Eisenhart. Join me now for a conversation with Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you. Welcome. Thanks a lot. Wonderful.
To explain, Jeffrey, because sometimes these concepts are easier to explain graphically than they are verbally, we'll be putting up a few slides, and I'll warn our radio audience now who's listening to this at some point in the future that we will do our best to explain the slides as we put them up there. Maybe it was Adam Smith who said economy should be self-organizing, and I think it's true of conversations too. They should be self-organizing. However, a little intelligent design doesn't hurt, and so I'm going to lay out a structure that I think can help us get our arms around this tremendously large and almost overwhelming topic that you address so efficiently and expertly in your book. I think I see it at least with three parts. How did we get to where we are now? What is broken now, and what is it that broke it? Those sound like two separate topics, but they really go together. Secondly is, why has not the various steps, starting with the Bush administration, and following up with the Obama administration, why were they not only unsuccessful or relatively unsuccessful, but predictably unsuccessful? And third, and most important really, because this is the optimistic part of your book, and I want us to leave on an upbeat tonight.
Promise.
What are your thoughts about the real policy steps that need to be taken?
Let's do it. I think, Roy, maybe the starting point is why we're feeling so miserable right now, kind of the symptoms. And the litany of problems is well known to us, but it's worth recalling. We've had a very serious recession, of course, high unemployment, a massive number of jobs lost, real incomes across America having gone down, people having lost a lot of wealth. That's one part of our syndrome. We're feeling lousy because the economy is at best sputtering and at worst risking going over the cliff one more time. The second thing is we feel that as a society, something's come unhinged. America was the great middle-class society. We defined a country where everybody was part of the middle class, it seemed. That was what used to be said 40 years ago. Now we feel like a society divided between the rich and the poor, and holding on to the middle class is becoming harder and harder for tens of millions of households. That's inequality, and that fragility is a second part of our problem. The third part of our problem is political economy. We can't seem to agree on anything We have a massive budget deficit. We are bleeding red ink. We're borrowing trillions of dollars, including from China, our main creditor now, as well as from other countries in the world. And Washington seems utterly dysfunctional just about every day. So this is leading the biggest majority of modern times of Americans to agree on two things. One, the country is heading seriously in the wrong direction. And second, Washington seems like a foreign object to us. In some opinion surveys, Washington is called a special interest group by the American people. It's a strange concept for our government. But this is how we feel about it. What are they doing? Who are they representing? So that's the backdrop for this book. The book opens with that scenario of symptoms. And then my approach as an advisor to governments for the last quarter century all over the world has been to say that you can't treat symptoms. You have to get to a more basic differential diagnosis. You have to explain what's going on. Mm-hmm. And as I wrote the book, it was for me almost another attempt at a clinical diagnosis. And start with the symptoms and you say, well, it's the financial crash. That was 2008. Lehman Brothers, September 14 goes belly up. The whole world economy goes into crisis. But why did we get there? Well, a lot of mistakes were made, deregulation, bad monetary policy, an overlooked bubble. But why did we get there? Well, because in the late 1990s, both President Clinton and the Congress agreed to take away rules that had kept us actually safe and in good stead since 1933, since the Great Depression, the Glass-Steagall law, for example, which had separated investment banking and commercial banking. Well, why did they do that? That seems odd. That took us back to deregulation that started even in the 1980s. The first lifting of the lid of deregulation was to deregulate the savings and loan industry. It took only about 3 years for that to end up in a complete calamity and a bailout by the taxpayers. Well, why did we do this again and again and again? All of a sudden, you see it's not a moment, it's not 2008, it's not a particular crisis. It's a way that we're governing ourselves. It's a way that our politics are working. It's a way that we're viewing the economy. As I took the story back, I felt that a relatively realistic starting point was the 1970s, and which was a decade of a lot of instability. The U.S. dollar had been the center of the world currency system, brushed away in August 1971. The oil shocks in 1973 and 74, and then again in 1979, the high inflation of the Carter years with the big instability. The first real feeling we had that our industry was under assault from foreign competition. We ruled the world, and then all of a sudden cars that we never heard of were coming from Japan and taking over a larger and larger part of our market.
And now, let's not forget the Vietnam War. Also.
The Vietnam War ended as a tragic waste and loss in 1975, Watergate. The whole period was a very unsettled decade for the United States. But it required a diagnosis. What's happening? The U.S. had been the great leader of the world economy in the 1950s and the 1960s. We were dynamic. We put a man on the moon and back, and then all of a sudden, trouble, stumble. And here is where I think things really took a decisive turn in our politics and in our society. There was the underlying changes that were starting, which I'll describe in a moment, and then there was a diagnosis made. And the diagnosis, to my mind, was fundamentally wrong, but it stuck. Now, the underlying problem, in my view, is that we were experiencing the first deep changes of a global economy that we now call globalization. And globalization means that the world was becoming interconnected in ways much more deep than simple trade, but also in production systems, in the flow of technology, in the ability to offshore labor, and the ability to outsource technologies. This was the beginning in the 1970s. But we didn't understand that yet. It was just the glimmers. A diagnosis was made about the 1970s that, in my view, was fateful and wrong. And I'm sorry to say it emanated from this state in the person of Mr. Reagan. Because when President Reagan came into office, won the election in 1980, came into office on January 20, 1981, he made a famous and I think profoundly wrong-headed statement. He said, "Government is not the solution. Government is the problem." My first recommendation would be somebody that believes that, please don't run for president. Because we need somebody in the presidency that actually believes that government is the solution. We have the same syndrome, by the way, with Rick Perry, who says that his goal as president would be to make the federal government as inconsequential to the American people as possible. Oh my God. This is just exactly what we don't need right now. But President Reagan began a process of demonizing the federal government and demonizing taxation in particular. Yeah. The whole idea was if we could just get rid of all that terrible government spending, then we could cut taxes and unleash the economy. Now, this you learn actually in Samuelson 101 and many other places is not a good idea. And it's not a good idea because a modern society actually needs a government. We need a government because the private economy can accomplish certain things, but it can't accomplish others. It can't make an educated population. The founding fathers knew that. Thomas Jefferson knew that. It can't make a national highway system. That's why we have a federal government. It could not have put a man on the moon and brought that man safely back to Earth. It could not have generated a lot of the basic science and technology that we still live on to this day. We needed government more than ever starting in the 1980s. This was the most important and basic point that I think we still don't recognize. Entering a new era of globalization required a more active government to ensure that globalization would not tear apart our society, that it would not punish the unskilled and the poor and leave them destitute while enabling the few at the top with financial capital and skills to take away everything. Yeah. Because globalization by itself brings us goods, it brings us new opportunities, it brings us expanded investments, but it does a job on lower skilled workers, it does a job on industries that can't compete with the emerging economies. We lost a tremendous amount of our manufacturing sector already starting in the 1980s, and that became a relentless process for 30 years. And many of our companies, which hire tremendously these days abroad, not here, say they can't even find the skilled workers here to fill those needs, so they're hiring in China or India rather than here. These are the kinds of areas that globalization required us to focus on. We should have understood, we should have made a diagnosis. We're living in a new world economy. The most fateful date of all for America isn't even known to this moment. It was 1978 when Deng Xiaoping came to power, opened China, changed the world in a way that has not been changed so decisively by anybody in recent history, because China's emergence on the world scene has reshaped the whole world economy, including the American economy.